was invited here because, as Rosa mentioned, I'm sort of a field worker, researcher in the world of vernacular photography, working primarily in conflict areas, so in countries that are affected by all sorts of forms of conflict and maybe don't have the opportunity to archive their history or work on creating archives or any form of sort of narratives through archive images. And I also work in countries like China or Turkey, where I would sort of put them into that sort of a field. So I work on large-scale archives. That means I actually collect and create archives by doing research, by finding photographs and materials, and present them not only in books but also in exhibitions and other forms, always through collaborations locally, and either through my outlet, which I will talk about in a second, or other outlets and other publishers. So I was given two topics here to sort of talk about. Vernacular photography as a remix material around the world, what can we publish from found photographs, and the operation and experience as a private publishing house, which is obviously what I run. So when I read the first question, for me, the first thing that came up in my mind is, of course, the ethics of publishing when it comes to someone like me, a European with all that European privilege who works primarily in the global south, coming with an idea of what has to be valued in terms of culture, what has to be given emphasis to, what should be archived, what should be preserved. And I definitely am now at a very different point than I was 15 years ago when I started sort of this kind of work. And I would like to put this small talk here into several lessons that I've learned through my process of sort of making things and also the shortcomings of my making. One of the first large-scale archive projects I've worked on was in Afghanistan. It's called the Afghan box camera project. Together with my colleague Jean Foley, an Irish ethnographer, we want to explore the history of these kind of cameras, so these box cameras. I mean, there's many different local names for these cameras. They're wooden boxes that are camera and darkroom in one, so you develop in the box, on the spot, on photographic paper. In Europe and North America, they started to spread from like 1910 to 1920, and if you go from Europe further east or from the US further south, this technology stayed on for quite a long time. In Afghanistan, where we worked, we had the last sort of working box camera photographers on the street, everyday practice in like 2010. And I came across them. I did a research on tourism to war zones in Afghanistan, and I found these still working photographers with these cameras on the street. And as a photographer, it's quite mind-blowing that you still have practicing photographers who actually use these cameras and make a living from it on an everyday basis. So for me, this was quite mind-blowing, and then we started this sort of long-term research. And that research was sort of to find narratives around these found images like you see on the top, and around the practices of these photographers. So for us, it was to understand an oral history, because it was largely an undocumented history of these photographers and how they used these cameras and how this incredible imagery came into being. And so we started to go out and did field work, field research, a ton of interviews, a ton of photographs with the photographers. We also reenacted films on how to use these cameras. We also created films on how to build these cameras with carpenters, and also produced manuals basically on how these cameras were made, because they're not part of a set industry. They're not like Nikon and Sony. They're made by carpenters or by the photographers themselves. So there's no set form of how this camera functions, and that's really a fascinating sort of element of that camera, is that you don't work with technology the way when you think about photography, as in technology constantly changes, as we heard before, from dry plates or wet plates to dry plates to film and to digital. This camera hasn't changed for the last 100 years at all. It still works in exactly the same way with the same photographic paper, chemicals. I mean, slight difference in maybe compositions of chemicals, but in essence, it's the same. So when you are engaged with this type of photography, you're not engaged with technology, you're engaged with mythology. Because it's all about the stories around these photographs and the photographers that use that camera. So to give you an example, we interviewed a photographer who, he passed by now, but it was very active in the 60s and 70s when there was quite some money to be made, administrative purposes, needed photography, passport photos, so this camera was perfect for that. And this photographer told us the story that in the 60s he went to a village because apparently there was no photographer yet. So he went there with his camera. We have to imagine this was maybe on a donkey or maybe on a bicycle, maybe on a motorbike going over the Hindu Kush or to some remote town and village. So he arrived. He realized there was already another photographer actually working there. He set up his shop. And he realized that this photographer was really fast. Like, usually it takes time to take these pictures because you take a photograph, you develop it in the camera with chemicals, you have a negative, you re-photograph it in front of the camera, you get a positive. So it might take 5 to 10 minutes. But he noticed that this photographer was very fast. It took him like a minute. So at the end of the day, he was like, wow, so how? He approached him and asked him, how did you do that? How did you create 200 photos in a day and make such good money? And he explained to him, well, we are in the countryside. They've never had a photograph taken of themselves. They don't know what they look like. So I proposed them 3 types of hats: a turban, a pakul, which is like a round flat hat, and a pot hat, sort of a white Islamic hat. And I just pretend to take a photo, and then on the back of the camera I take out pre-made photos that are blurry, just with a focused hat. So true or not, I don't know, but it's a fantastic story. And this is exactly what this camera is all about, the mythology. How these practitioners with so little produced so much. So these are school children near Herat in the west of Afghanistan from a collection we gathered there. So it was all about finding an engaging narrative to these very few images that we found, or were still sort of in place. And this engaging narrative meant for us to collect these oral stories and also make audiovisual material, like I said before, interesting videos on how to use these cameras. So we found one photographer who's, was willing to act out and play sort of being the photographer and taking a picture, and we had a client and so on. And that really helped us to create this online archive, which is open source, freely available. You can download a manual on how to build these cameras, so on and so on. And because as analog is on the rise, as we heard from a talk before, this was about 15 years ago, we had, I would say, quite success with this online archive, and through that we got a publishing deal with Dowie Lewis, a British publisher, and we produced a beautiful book. It's all good. We brought it back to the photographers, created a certain pride and value, I would say, because now their story was more than just making a living, but also a part of history. And at that time, being a young photographer, I was quite, I would say, happy with this outcome, until I realized I have a deep regret. And that regret comes from not being able to share this story in any other language than English, because our website is in English, the book is in English, the book is €40. Who can afford €40 in the world? It's a very, very small part of society. So my regret was that we did not make a Dari or Pashto language version of the book, which is the primary languages in Afghanistan. And I still regret that. I mean, hopefully one day we can do it. Currently with the situation in Afghanistan, not, but let's see. So this was sort of a first very valuable lesson for me, that the information I produce as a photographer, as a researcher, I want to make available to those people who probably in the long term benefit most from it, and where it has most impact, and usually that's locally. That's not here in Europe. I mean, we created definitely an interesting movement with this. We created a positive impact about Afghanistan, but in the end, that history and that local culture is still not really available in Afghanistan, where it's completely has disappeared. So that was a lesson that I took on for myself, and I definitely wanted to change something in that. Because if you think about publishing, I mean, our current publishing structure, which is it's a power structure of sorts, and that power structure is denying a lot of information to a lot of people. I mean, I guess 95% of the books produced in a country that's outside the strong economic countries are not available there. So I'm sure we can go into a bookshop here in Budapest or Paris, London, try and find a book on Afghanistan or Myanmar, where I also work, but we can't find these books locally. And of course, if we can find them, then they're even more expensive than in Europe because there's no distribution structure. That means that they have to be imported, and then it's even more expensive. So for me, this was a very, very important part to rethink how this publishing structure can be changed or appropriated for myself. So that's why I started Fraglich Publishing, which is a very small publishing house in Austria. Fraglich means questionable, because I thought, oh, now I'm starting to make history books, but I don't really believe in history books because we have to rethink history all the time and we have to constantly question what we do, and I should question what I do, and I could question myself. So, okay, let's put it under parenthesis and just call it questionable publishing. And we produce history books, but yeah, these history books are under constant questioning by myself. And I mean, that's also what I think what we're doing with vernacular photography right now, that there's a lot of questioning and rethinking history, and vernacular has been used as a tool to rethink history, and I guess this is sort of parts of it. So I would say that was my first lesson from an ethical point of view that relates to the question I was asked, what can we publish? And in my case also, how? In 2013, I was very curious because I worked in the area. I worked a lot in India and China, and also a bit in Southeast Asia. I was very curious to see what has happened in terms of archiving, photographic practice in Myanmar, in Burma. So there was a period where the country had opened up after 60 years of military regime. So 2011-12, it started to sort of expand a bit. And I wanted to see what is there available after such a long period of military rule. And 1963, that's when the military took over. And in 2013-14, I did my first trips there, and I really realized that there were no publicly accessible archives. There is a state archive, it's very obscure and definitely not accessible, but there were no records, no visual history elements available to the public. The only thing you would find in sort of reference to the past are images like these, which you probably have seen, these kind of hand-colored postcards produced during colonial times by foreign photographers who lived in Myanmar, because I mean, Myanmar, Burma at the time was a strong economic center. At points, it was the capital of the British Empire abroad, turned from India to Yangon. It was an enormous export country. There were huge influx of merchants there, and there was also tourism. And these postcards were produced by foreign photographers for foreign tourists, printed in Germany, brought back to Myanmar, sold to foreigners. And that's sort of the visual representation we still have when people in Myanmar think about the past, because these are the images that are available. And in many European collections, we have a vast representation of photographers that worked in Myanmar, whether it's British, German, or Italian photographers who produced images like this. Types, the stereotypes, I mean, that's a whole other field. So with a couple of enthusiasts in Myanmar, we started to collect images locally, which was at that time quite easy because nobody had ever looked. So within a few years, we had 30,000 photographs from a huge array of subject matters. And we wanted to start produce also stories and narratives. Now for me, it's really important with all the work I do that I collaborate locally, because and with locals, people who have an actual access to what the materials mean, because as a foreigner, that is to my experience, it's inevitable that there is a form of an exotic eye on images. So in order to break with that almost aesthetic fetishism, I would say, if you're the other, then it helps to collaborate with locals to sort of cut through that and rethink the materials differently. So in any case, the first story we produced was a story of a set of images, a large set of images I found, which was fashion photographs produced in Yangon, sort of around the 70s. And we had hundreds and hundreds of these, and in the beginning I couldn't figure out what they are. I mean, they're so stylized, such specific clothing, posing, obviously great lighting, fashion photos, but they were not made for industry. They were not made for advertisement or magazines. They were produced solely for private purpose. And I wanted to deeper and understand what this is all about. So we did an interview series with people who were young at the time, and we were told that basically these are photographs taken primarily around the universities of Yangon of people who would import, partly legally, fashion magazines from the West, because at that time it was a very oppressive regime. Socially, it was not accepted to wear Western clothing in public. So these imported magazines were then brought to tailors, and these tailors would then make flared trousers and 1970s outfits and mini skirts, and people got then photographed in the studio, and these photos were solely there for exchange, similar to carte de visite that we had early on. But what's fantastic, of course, is that here the photo studio, the medium photography, was used as this free space of expression, of a small, slight resistance through what happened socially on the outside. And it stayed, obviously, in a private sphere. It was an exchange in a private sphere, but it became, an area of expression and a rather large one, because just in our archives we have hundreds, if not 2,000 or 3,000 of these images of fashion photographs of these students who exchanged these photographs. So I thought, wow, that's a great story, beautiful imagery. How can we bring that into sort of a public discourse as a first approach to connect our historic archive to the public? At that time, as I said, the structure in Myanmar was slowly opening up, so it was possible to also make public displays, and we collaborated with the Yangon Photo Festival, an organization run by a French photographer, Christophe Levini, who usually showcased inside the embassies because it was not possible to showcase outside. But for the first time, we could make public displays. So we made these oversized, life-sized displays in Mahabandula Park, in the Central Park, where we could get 100,000 people to interact within like a month or 6 weeks with these images. And maybe to understand, besides, right now again, there's a military oppression in Myanmar, but not only that, Myanmar has strong ethnic internal conflicts and differences, which is a very large subject, but there's also a ton of stereotyping towards different ethnicities internally. So what was, of course, fantastic and a lesson for me and all of us who worked on this to learn was how these displays of images could actually bring people together. Because most of the people that interacted there and we talked to said, like, yeah, I have a picture like that from my auntie and my uncle and my mom, but of course I had no idea that this was a common practice. Because we can only understand if there's a common practice if we actually have accessibility to this part of visual culture, which is not the case in Myanmar. So it was wonderful to see how so many people interacted also with anybody who lived at that time. So it wasn't a question anymore of ethnicity, whether you're Sino, Indo, Burmese, or Bama, or Kachin, Karen, or any other ethnicity. So it was fantastic how this imagery became a unifier. And it was also surprising for my Burmese colleagues to see how people interacted and internalized these photographs. The selfie is a big thing for that, and I wouldn't trivialize the selfie. I think it's a wonderful tool to becoming or getting closer to what we see and identifying with what we see, and that was obviously huge there. So that was sort of the first step for us, and to realize that okay, it's time to really take this serious and start an archive. So we started the Myanmar Photo Archive, started to make different exhibitions, displays, publications. That's an exhibition we did in a colonial building called the Secretariat, where we sort of structured for the first time local Burmese photography. Because as I said before, we have a lot of material from colonial photography, very well researched, lots of exhibitions anywhere in the world, but there are no local structures. So we slowly figured out, okay, there were the first local studios in like 1910, they continued throughout colonial periods till World War II. Who photographed during World War II? The Japanese took partly over parts of Myanmar. Then there was this in-between period. 1948 was the independence. 1963 the military took over. So we tried to structure in what kind of photographs have been taken in Myanmar, who were the practitioners, what were the practices, on a very basic level, just to create sort of a basic platform that other people then hopefully can work further on that. And we could see that there was an enormous interest. We had also, I don't know the numbers, 50, 60,000 people within a few weeks in this old building, because there is no accessibility to visual culture, not at all to the past. We have a ton of literature. The Buddhist records are fantastic. There's lots of other things in Myanmar, but visual culture has been very, very, very poor in that sense. And we also started to produce books locally. Now, there's no real photo book culture there. So for me, it's as someone who likes to make book objects and believes in the book object, it was important to sort of foster the idea of creating local photo books. There are no binding machines with thread binding, so we had to think about different formats. So I did workshops on these sort of thread bindings with very, very skilled craftsmen who helped us produce beautiful publications. So, and that was a real, a beautiful, I would say, journey to make local stories with these locally produced materials, and we also sold them locally. That means we actually sell the books there for maybe €5, depends on the book, around €5 per book. So that's within the frame of literature. So that's what people are used to spending. And we use local literature distribution to actually distribute the books. And until COVID and now the military regime, the new takeover, we've done very well with this. We've made exhibitions every year and different books, and I would say most of them are sold out. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies out there of something. So that was for me really a big lesson that even in an environment where there is no photo book culture so far because of economy, because of accessibility, you can foster an audience if you create the right environment, if you make the right price point, which is obviously key. And this project, I would say, is again, now luckily we always have, the question for these kind of projects is always how do you fund these projects? So I use my privileged position to get money a little bit from the British Library or the Goethe Institutes or the European Union or the Austrian Arts Council and so on, and then sort of funnel that through. And right now we have the opportunity with the Goethe Institute funds to bring it a step further, I would say. We're currently giving 45 grants to writers, scholars, visual artists to reinterpret this archive and also bring in money into the country and to artists, which is obviously desperately needed at the moment. So that's sort of a larger, I would say, ongoing project of mine, working with vernacular photography on the ground. And again, this is very, very different, I think, than working with vernacular photography in Europe or the US, where we do have a lot of materials. We actually do have a lot of archives. The question is often, how do we use these archives? How we interpret these archives? Versus there's no availability at all. So you can actually, with very little, I would say, you can create an enormous impact and also start something. I mean, that's at least my experience from there. So, yeah, I would say that's sort of a lesson learned from that, is that with the right intention and with pulling the right resources on already existing structures, you can find an audience for vernacular photography, for photo books, for exhibitions on photographic culture, so on and so actually much easier, I think, than in Europe, where we have to spend a ton of advertisement budget so people actually come to your event, and it's not really the case there. So that's sort of, I would say the lessons learned, some of the lessons learned within the question I was asked, what can we publish globally? And to that second point about my own publishing project, I publish with Fraglich Publishing around 4, depends on the year, 4 books per year. That means, it's obviously not a lot of books, we can give a lot of emphasis to these books. We have of course a couple of collectors, but we don't focus like established publishing structures on a specific distribution setting. You have your museum shops, you have your bookshops, and they will buy, and so on and so on. We can't rely on that. Every book is a new journey. Every book demands its new audience. And that's a great opportunity to, every single time, try and find a new audience and try to find a new engagement according to the content we have. And in a way, it also pushes the materials to form a call for action almost. I mean, that's what I like to do. Same if we make books in Myanmar, by just creating photo books in a place where there are none, we create a call for action to other artists and photographers that you can actually do it locally. And it would be the same with very small projects. Like there's a recent book I just made. It's a tiny book on just a small collection of my hand-colored photographs. I love hand-colored photographs from around the world. So it's just this very simple Leporello mini object. Small books are easier to transport and ship, so I like small books. But on the other side, we also have manuals on how to do it. So that we foster sort of the idea that, hey, you can hand-color your own photographs. So we continue that tradition, and we also offer sets with hand-coloring pencils and brushes and so on. So this is obviously a tiny example, but it's all about how you can use vernacular photography to create, as we said before in talks, a value towards what you might have yourself, an appreciation, and then maybe even a continuation. And that also happened with the Afghan box camera project that I talked about earlier, where over the years, because it is an open source project and we received, it is an open source project and we produced these manuals on how to build cameras, so we received so many photographs from photographers around the world who built their own camera in this Afghan fashion. Now this camera has been popular in other countries as well for a while, but because at that time it was the rise of analog photography and Afghanistan, it had a momentum and it was published quite well in the media. So all of a sudden we had photographers who would send us their photos of their camera that they built, and they would call it Afghan box camera, which is fantastic because it's just a name I made up because I didn't know what to call it. It's Afghanistan, it's a box, it's a camera. Locally it's called something different, Camera Euphorie. But that name was taken on, and that means that we have now, beyond our project, this cultural heritage of Afghanistan, which is taken on and embodied by people because they build cameras in the fashion of these Afghan cameras. They call it Afghan camera. So we have a continuation of that Afghan culture on the street now, where people like, he's not on this, Guillaume, on the very left, he works full-time in Arles. He has a camera set up there, and he lives from this photography. So through the story of these vernacular photographs we found, the oral history we connected to it in Afghanistan, through the entertaining sort of elements we produced on the website, photographers found it and created a living from that. And that's sort of that call for action where we can create a living continuation of the past. And that's sort of what I'm very much interested in. And we have many of these sort of stories with these photographers. Hans Zeltlib, he traveled the world for 1 year using the camera as his main income, creating a form of exchange for food, money, so on. So it was a beautiful way to see how a project that is research-based, that is based on images, can actually become something else. And I also then made a community book called Box Camera Now with these photographers, sort of bringing that community together, and I'd say the The latest extension of this is we have a small production in Austria in a youth center that works with Afghan refugees, so for me full circle, where we produce these cameras in a kit form so people can, for an affordable price, buy these cameras and build them at home. So that we also give people who maybe are not that crafty and access to these cameras. So that for me is sort of, that kind of call for action that I really loved or come to love in the last years with vernacular photography. So I would say the key for me is always with the publishing and my experiences, that's what I was asked about in terms of my experience as a small publishing house, is how I have the capability or the possibility, because of the limitations of distribution, of money, so on, create a very specific audience for the books we make. This is a small story, a very small story, of a small family archive that the curator Natasha Christia and I found in Istanbul, of a couple that in the 60s and 70s would go to all the good restaurants in Istanbul. Now, all these restaurants at that time had photo service. So they would take pictures of the clientele, they had a darkroom in the basement, they would develop the photographs right away and give it to you at the end of the evening in these beautiful designed cards. So 1960 design, beautiful. So I found this whole family archive of this couple who lived the new modern idea of life in Istanbul at the time and had sort of this auto-portrait of their life in the 60s and 70s. And these are the small, intimate stories I think that many of us engaged with vernacular photography love, where we can not read about history from a top-down structure about someone who writes about history, but see history lived by those who lived it. And how these intimate stories, that, like this one here from Istanbul, can actually tell us so much about how, at a specific time, a specific part of society lived that place and lived the environment. And so these are the small records that I'm really, really keen on finding and keen on publishing, and also again publish locally. I mean, this we printed in Turkey, we distribute there as well. It's wonderful to see the engagement we have of local people, who everybody says, yeah, of course we have these kind of photos at home, and wow, of course now I'm seeing them very differently, and maybe I should look at them again. And that's what, of course, what these books do, is create value for people's own archives. And I mean, that's part of the, I guess, the vernacular movement is also to establish that kind of value. And that's a big part for me, how to give this testimony to people's own archives. So I also do a lot of workshops where people can bring in their archives. We make digitization stations, that's from Myanmar, where people bring in their photographs of families also, and we digitize their archives. They can take them back home, so that we have an exhibition at the same time there's a call for action, bring us the images, we record your stories, and then sort of I would say a continuation of the life of these images. So in a way to sum up these two questions I was asked, I think there's an enormous amount of material we can publish. For me, the key, as I said before, working as a foreigner always in places, is collaboration, to make sure that there is a local engagement, that I'm not just, I go somewhere, I bring something back, full stop, that sort of counter the idea. And to really draw my attention into that the energy of local production, local publishing, local distribution, and sort of trying to make the information accessible where it should be accessible. Thank you.